The forest had a name that no living tongue dared speak aloud. In the old language of the hill women, those wrinkled herbalists who passed their knowledge through whispered lessons and ink-stained manuscripts, it was called Velundra, the place where the world breathes. The villagers of Ashenmoor simply called it the Deepwood, and in their voices, that word carried the same weight as flood or fever. Something to be respected, something to be feared, something that, if you were clever, you did not enter past the hour when the light turned amber and the birdsong fell silent. Sonia had been entering it since she was 9 years old. She knew this made her either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, and on most mornings she could not tell the difference. What she did know was that the healers in Ashenmoor paid 2 copper coins for a bundle of fresh moon thread, 3 for dried thornbloom, and 5 whole copper coins for the pale, ghost-white blossoms of the nightbell flower, which only grew in the oldest parts of the Deepwood, where the roots of the trees were as thick as a man's body, and the soil beneath your feet felt faintly warm, as though the earth itself had a pulse. It was the nightbell that brought her deep today. She moved between the trees with the practiced ease of someone who had memorized every root and hollow, every place where the ground turned soft and treacherous after rain. The forest was alive in the particular way it always was at this hour, the first true dark of evening, when the sky above the canopy held the last blue light of day and the undergrowth below had already swallowed the shadows. Somewhere to her left, a thorn guardian shifted. She felt it more than heard it. A low tremor in the soil, a subtle rearrangement of pressure, as though something very large and very old had turned its attention in her direction, and then, deciding she was no threat, turned away again. Thorn guardians were not hostile to humans who walked quietly and took only what they needed. This was one of the first things the hill women had taught her. Walk like you belong, and the forest believes it. She had walked like she belonged every day for 13 years. The nightbell grew in a small clearing she had discovered 2 seasons ago, in the hollow of a collapsed ancient oak. The tree had been enormous in its living days. She estimated it would have taken 8 adults with linked hands to circle its trunk, and in its death it had become something stranger and more generous. The rot had softened its heartwood into something almost soil-like, and from that softness the nightbell emerged in clusters, small, fragile, impossibly white blossoms that smelled like cold stone and something else beneath it, something she had never been able to name, not quite sweet, not quite sharp, something older than either. She was kneeling at the hollow, her fingers careful and practiced among the flowers, when she heard the sound. It was not the sound of a thorn guardian. Those moved with a low subterranean vibration, a geological kind of presence. This was different. This was overhead. A sudden stillness in the canopy, as though every bird and insect had simultaneously understood that something had entered the space and decided, unanimously, to become invisible. Sonia went very still. For 3 years, she had been entering the deep forest at dusk. In those 3 years, she had encountered thorn guardians, bone spirits rising from old burial mounds, the occasional shadow wraith drifting between the elder trees like smoke that had forgotten to dissipate. She had learned to remain still when these things were near. Stillness was usually enough. She made herself breathe slowly, her hands resting open on her knees, the half-gathered bundle of nightbell pressed between her fingers. The clearing remained silent. Then a branch cracked, Not the heavy subterranean crack of something enormous, but a sharp, deliberate sound like something choosing to announce itself, like something that understood the difference between stealth and courtesy and had chosen courtesy. He stepped out from between two rowan trees at the far edge of the clearing, and Sonia's first thought, irrational, involuntary, was that the light had followed him in. He was tall, not merely tall in the way that some men were tall, but tall in the way that old trees were tall, with a kind of height that seemed natural and inevitable, as though the world had arranged itself to accommodate him. His hair was pale gold under the last of the evening light, cropped close and slightly disheveled, catching the gloom like something that had not entirely agreed to stop shining. He was dressed in what should have been armor but looked more like something the forest itself might have worn. Dark blue fabric so deep it was almost black, with details carved from what appeared to be living wood. Subtle organic patterns that seemed to breathe when the light shifted across them. A short cloak fell from his shoulders, its edges moving in a wind that was not blowing. His eyes were the part of him that made her breath stop. They were blue, deeply, impossibly blue, but within that blue there were secondary lights, silver threads that moved like something submerged in water, responding to stimuli she couldn't identify. In that first moment of looking at them, she had the dizzying sense that she was looking at something that had existed for a very long time, something that had watched seasons and centuries come and go with the same patient attention. Fae. The word formed in her mind before conscious thought caught up to it. Fae. He looked at her across the clearing for a long moment. She looked back at him. In the old stories, in the manuscripts the hill women passed from hand to hand, there were many instructions for what to do when you encountered a creature of the fair folk. Do not eat their food. Do not speak their true name. Do not make a bargain you do not fully understand. Do not let them know what you love. None of the manuscripts had addressed what to do when one of them simply stood at the edge of your night bell clearing and looked at you with quiet, silver-threaded eyes, as though he had been expecting to find you there. Who are you? She did not say it aloud. She was not entirely sure she could speak. He tilted his head slightly, and the movement was so precisely like the way the Thorn Guardians turned their attention toward things, that slow, geological quality of a very old consciousness orienting itself, that she felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. Then he spoke. You take only what you need. His voice was low and even, with a quality to it that she had no word for, something that resonated in her chest the way a struck bell resonated, as though the sound was looking for somewhere to settle. It was not a question. It was an observation. She found her voice somewhere underneath the shock. I try to. You've been taking only what you need for 3 years. Another observation. The night bell in this hollow has regrown 17 times since you first found it. Without you, it would have been taken by shadow wraiths in the 2nd season. The disruption of your presence kept them away. She stared at him. You've been watching me for 3 years. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one. Something that suggested he was familiar with amusement, but not in the habit of displaying it. The forest watches. I am part of the forest. She looked down at her hands, at the night bell flowers, at the mundane reality of her gathering basket and her worn linen gloves and the copper coins she would take back to the village tomorrow. Then she looked back up at him, at the impossible blue of his eyes and the way the cloak's edge moved against no wind, and felt the specific vertigo of a life that has just changed direction. "You're the king," she said. Not a question. He regarded her steadily. "And you are not afraid." "I didn't say that." She made herself hold his gaze. "I said you're the king." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. That silence had been the silence of uncertainty, of two beings encountering each other across the border between their worlds. This silence was something else, something that felt, in a way she could not explain, like the beginning of a conversation that would not end for a very long time. In the shadows at the edge of the clearing, where the rowan trees grew thick and the old darkness pressed close, something neither of them noticed shifted its attention toward them. Something old, something patient, something that had been waiting for exactly this. She told herself she would not go back. That was the reasonable thing, the sensible thing, the thing that every Hillwoman manuscript, every whispered warning, every piece of inherited wisdom about the Deepwood pointed toward with unanimous clarity. You did not return to a place where you had encountered a Fae. You did not repeat the circumstances of an impossible meeting. You took your night bell flowers and your copper coins and your intact, ordinary life, and you kept them intact by never testing the borders of what you knew again. Sonia lasted 4 days. On the 5th evening, she told herself she was going back for the night bell, the second cluster, the one in the hollow 3 degrees east of the collapsed oak, the one she had not finished harvesting. This was a reasonable justification. The healers needed the flowers, she needed the coins. The route happened to pass through the same clearing. These facts were entirely independent of each other. She believed approximately none of this by the time she reached the tree line. The forest received her the way it always had, with that particular quality of attention that the Deepwood reserved for things it recognized. The thorn guardians did not stir. The shadows held their position. Above her, the canopy shifted in the windless way it sometimes did, a slow breathing movement, as though the trees were settling around her presence the way water settles around a stone. She moved through the familiar dark and tried not to notice that her heart was doing something unusual. The clearing was empty when she arrived. Of course it was. She set her basket down beside the collapsed oak and knelt at the night bell hollow, and told herself the specific tightness in her chest was disappointment about the flowers and nothing else. And then she heard the same deliberate crack of a branch, the same sound he had made before, that careful announcement of presence. And every pretense she had constructed over 4 days dissolved into the evening air. He was standing at the same gap between the rowan trees. Same dark armor, same pale gold hair, same impossible eyes. But something was different tonight. He was not watching her with the detached observation of 3 years of silent guardianship. He was watching her with something more specific, something that had a direction to it. "You came back," he said. "I came for the night bell." A pause. "There is no second cluster east of this hollow." She looked up at him. "What?" "There has never been a second cluster. You harvested it completely in your second season. You know this." His voice carried no reproach, only the same even quality, that settled resonance. "You came back for another reason." The silence that followed was long enough that a bone spirit drifted through the far edge of the clearing, its pale light guttering like a candle in a room with no wind, and neither of them looked at it. "That was presumptuous," Sonia said at last. "It was accurate," Ebramir said. She found she had nothing to argue with that was not at its core a lie. They did not speak of important things that night. They spoke of the forest, of the night bell's growing patterns, of the bone spirits and their cyclical migrations, of the Thorn Guardians and the territorial boundaries they maintained with the geometric precision of old treaties. He spoke of these things with the easy authority of someone who had watched them for centuries, and she spoke of them with the practical knowledge of someone who had navigated them for years. And somewhere in the overlap of those two perspectives, a conversation happened that felt, despite everything it should not have felt, entirely natural. She left before full dark. She did not say she would return, neither did he. She was back in 3 days. This became the shape of the weeks that followed. She would arrive at the clearing at the specific hour when the sky held its last blue light, and he would be there, always at the Rowan Gap, always with that same quality of having arranged himself not to startle her, that same courtesy that the oldest stories never attributed to Fae Kings, and that she found, against all reasonable judgment, quietly devastating. They would sit, her on the root shelf of the collapsed oak, him at whatever distance felt neither too close nor too deliberate, and talk until the dark became complete enough that she needed her small lamp to find the path home. She learned things about him in fragments, the way you learn things about a very old landscape, gradually, through accumulated exposure, through noticing what changed and what stayed constant. He was not careless with information about himself the way that humans were careless. He offered nothing accidentally. But when he did offer something, a memory of the forest 200 years before, an observation about the Seelie court and its seasonal politics, a quiet admission that the bone spirits had been restless since the last winter solstice in a way he found concerning, it had the quality of something genuinely given, not performed, not strategic, given. She offered things in return, her own fragments, the hill women and their manuscripts. Her mother, who had died when she was 12, who had also walked the forest and who had known something, Sonia had always suspected, something about the places where the veil grew thin. The particular loneliness of being someone who understood a world that no one else in her village could see clearly. He listened to all of it with the specific quality of attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he listened to everything, fully, without the partial presence that most people brought to conversation, without the sense that part of his mind was already formulating his response. He listened as though whatever she was saying was the only thing currently happening in the world. This, she was discovering, was the most dangerous thing about him. Not the silver-threaded eyes or the impossible blue of them, not the way the forest oriented itself around his presence, like iron filings around a magnetic field, not the centuries in his voice or the quiet authority of his movements, the listening. On the 14th evening, he sat beside her on the root shelf of the oak for the first time. He did not comment on this. Neither did she. He simply arrived and, instead of taking his usual position at the clearing's edge, settled beside her with the unhurried deliberateness of something that has made a decision and is not going to perform uncertainty about it. She was acutely aware of the distance between them, perhaps 2 handspans, and of the way that distance felt like something meaningful, like a threshold or a border, like one of those places in the forest where the quality of the air changes and, without being told, that you have crossed from one territory into another. They sat in the first silence they had ever shared that was not comfortable. "Your forest is going to be the death of me," she said at last, not because it was what she intended to say, but because something needed to be said, and that had the advantage of being true in multiple ways simultaneously. He was quiet for a moment. "My forest has been trying to protect you." She turned to look at him. At this distance, the silver lights in his eyes were more visible, those moving threads of secondary color, responding to something she still couldn't identify. Up close, his face had the quality of something carved from extremely fine material by someone who had taken considerable time and then stepped back and found they had made something that exceeded what they were trying to make. She looked away first. Ebramir. It was the first time she had used his name. She heard the slight shift in his breathing, a change so small that she wouldn't have noticed it if she had not, over 14 evenings, learned the rhythms of how he inhabited silence. "What is this?" Another pause. Longer. "I don't know," he said, and the careful evenness of his voice had something in it that she had not heard before, something unguarded. "In 600 years I have not encountered a thing I could not name." She felt the weight of that. 600 years of a mind that organized and understood everything it encountered, meeting something it could not categorize. She felt, absurdly, a small and completely inappropriate warmth. "Welcome to the experience," she said, and for the first time, genuinely, without the adjacent quality or the almost. He smiled. She did not see the shadow at the edge of the clearing. She was not meant to. It had no body in the way that bodies were understood, no form that the Thorn Guardians could register as territory, no weight that the bone spirits could sense in their migration routes. It was older than both. It was in the specific way that certain things in the deep forest were old, a kind of consciousness that had learned to exist entirely in the spaces between observation. It had a name, several names accumulated across centuries. The villagers of Ashenmoor did not know any of them. The Hill Women's manuscripts mentioned one, Maerath, in a single passage, and then moved on quickly, the way manuscripts did when the author had thought better of lingering. Maerath watched the girl and the king sitting side by side on the root shelf of the old oak. She watched the 14 evenings of accumulated conversation, the careful distance and its gradual erosion, the specific quality of attention that the king brought to the girl's words. She watched the smile, that genuine, unguarded smile, and felt something move through her ancient consciousness that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but was constructed from the same materials as both. He had never smiled at her like that. In 300 years of orbit, of waiting at the edge of his court, of offering power and knowledge and alliance, he had never turned that quality of attention toward her. She had offered him everything she had, and he had received it all with the gracious distance of a king accepting tribute. And now this girl, this small human creature who gathered flowers and sold them for copper coins, this girl sat beside him for 14 evenings and received the thing that Maerath had wanted for 3 centuries. She was not impulsive. She had not survived 300 years of the deep forest by being impulsive. She watched until the girl left. She watched the king remain at the edge of the clearing after she was gone, looking at the path she had taken into the dark, his expression carrying something she recognized as longing because she had seen it in her own reflection in still water for 3 centuries. Then she descended, not to the clearing, not yet. She moved instead to the space beneath the roots of the oldest tree in Valandra, an oak so ancient that its roots formed something close to architecture, a cathedral of wood and compressed earth, and she found the thing she had been keeping there for a very long time, a preparation, a working of considerable complexity and patience, built across decades in anticipation of a moment she had always known might come. Not a crude curse. She had too much respect for her own craft for that. This was something more elegant, something that would not announce itself, something that would begin as a slight cooling in the girl's blood, a faint blurring at the edges of her vision, a tiredness that sleep would not touch, something that would spread slowly through her body like frost through soil, unhurried and thorough and entirely silent. By the time anyone understood what was happening, it would already be nearly too late. Nearly, Maerath thought, was the most important word. Not too late. That would end the story too quickly, and she was not interested in a quick ending. She wanted him to watch. She wanted him to feel the approach of the loss, to understand what was being taken from him and why, to arrive at the moment when the only solution remaining was the one that would cost him everything. She wanted him to make the choice she had known for 300 years that he would make. She released the working into the roots of the old oak and let it travel through the dark toward the girl who gathered flowers and did not yet know that the world had changed. Above her, the Deepwood held its breath. Sonia walked home through the familiar dark, her lamp casting its small circle of warmth against the undergrowth, and thought about the way a smile could rearrange the architecture of an evening. She felt something she could not name move through her chest, not quite warmth and not quite fear, occupying exactly the space between the two, and told herself it was just the night air. By the time she reached the village, she felt, very faintly, cold. The trees told him on a Tuesday. He would remember this detail later in the long, colorless weeks that followed, with the specific clarity that the mind reserves for the moments immediately preceding catastrophe. A Tuesday. The light coming through the canopy at the low angle of late afternoon. A thorn guardian moving through the northern quarter of Velundra in its slow territorial circuit. Everything ordinary. Everything as it had been for 6 centuries. And then the root spoke. It was not language in the way that humans used language, not words or syntax or the architecture of meaning built from smaller parts. It was more fundamental than that. The Deepwood communicated through pressure and temperature and the specific quality of silence that different kinds of knowledge produced when they moved through living wood. Ebramir had been part of this network for so long that interpreting it had become as automatic as breathing, as involuntary as the way his body oriented itself toward north. What the roots told him stopped him completely. He stood in the middle of the forest with both hands pressed flat against the bark of an elder rowan, and he let the information move through him, and he did not move for a very long time. Maerath's working was not a simple thing. He had known her for 3 centuries, had known the architecture of her craft the way you know the recurring patterns in an adversary's thinking, and what the roots were showing him bore her signature in every layer. The slow onset, the elegant concealment, the way it had traveled through the root network itself, using the forest's own communication channels as a vector, so that by the time it reached Sonia, it looked like nothing more than a slight chill, a minor fatigue, the ordinary tiredness of a human body at the end of a long day. It was already in her blood. He straightened slowly and looked at the canopy above him, at the last light coming through the leaves in long amber shafts, and performed a calculation he had been hoping he would never need to perform. The working would take approximately 3 weeks to complete its progression. In the first week, fatigue, cold, the faint blurring at the edges of vision that Maerath favored as an opening signature. In the second, the cold would deepen, moving from the extremities inward, the body's warmth retreating toward its center in the specific pattern of a fire burning through its last fuel. In the third week, the frost would reach the heart. 3 weeks. He stood with this knowledge for the length of time it took the last amber light to fade from the canopy, and then he began to move through the forest with a purposefulness that the thorn guardians registered and stepped away from, clearing his path without being asked. There were, in theory, other options. He examined each one with the thoroughness of a mind that had spent 6 centuries solving problems and discarding incomplete solutions. He could attempt to counter Maerath's working directly, set his own power against hers in the root network, try to draw the frost out of Sonia's blood through the same channels it had entered. He had attempted something similar once, 2 centuries ago, with a different working, and he understood precisely why it would fail here. Maerath had specifically constructed this curse to be woven through the girl's own life force, threaded so finely through her essential self that removing it with external power would be like trying to remove salt from water by reaching in and pulling. The working and the person had already become the same thing. He could seek alliance. The older Seelie courts, the ones that maintained libraries of counterworkings accumulated across millennia. But the nearest of those courts was 3 days' travel, and alliance negotiations with the Seelie had their own elaborate protocols, their own costs and debts and binding agreements. He had 3 weeks. He had, more practically, no interest in placing Sonia in the web of Seelie obligation. He knew what those webs cost. He could confront Maerath. He stood with this option longer than the others. He was not afraid of Maerath. Fear was not quite the right category for what he felt about her, which was something closer to the specific wariness you felt about a thing you understood very well and therefore did not underestimate. He could find her. He could force the issue. But Maerath was 3 centuries old, and she had been building toward this specific moment for most of them, which meant she had prepared for exactly this response. A direct confrontation on her terms, at a moment of her choosing, was the most dangerous thing he could walk into, and walking into it without his full power intact would be walking into it already diminished, which brought him to the last option, the one that had been sitting at the edge of his thinking since the rowan told him what it knew, patient and inevitable as the tide. There was one working that Maerath could not have prepared for, because it was one that no Fae King had performed in recorded history, not because it was unknown. The mechanism existed in the oldest layers of Fae knowledge, had existed since before the courts were established, since the time when the boundary between the Fae and the forest was not a boundary at all. The complete and voluntary transfer of one's magical essence into another living being. Not a sharing, not a loan, but a full and permanent dissolution of one's own power into the specific curse currently inhabiting a human body, overwhelming it the way a river overwhelms a drought, drowning it in sheer living force until nothing of it remained. The cost was the cost. His power would not transfer to Sonia. It would simply cease. It would spend itself entirely in the act of destruction, burning through Maerath's working like a fire, burning through paper. And when it was done, there would be nothing left. Not dormancy, not diminishment, absence. He would wake the next morning as something he had not been for 6 centuries, a person without magic in a world built entirely around it. He thought about Sonia sitting on the root shelf of the old oak, her dark hair catching the last light, her voice carrying that specific quality of directness that she brought to every conversation. The way she said, "I didn't say that," when he suggested she wasn't afraid, the way she had looked at him across the clearing on 14 evenings and met his gaze without performing either fear or indifference. He thought about the smile she had not quite managed to hide on the 7th evening when he had admitted uncertainty about the bone spirit's migration patterns. He thought about the frost moving through her blood toward her heart. He stopped thinking about the other options. He waited until the village was fully dark. Not out of cowardice. He had decided, and the decision had that quality of settled permanence that his decisions always carried, the quality that came from a mind that did not commit to things lightly and therefore committed to them completely. He waited because he needed her to be asleep. He needed her to be somewhere he could sense her clearly, through the roots, through the living network of the Deepwood that extended its edges to the village boundary. And he needed to be certain she was not in pain. She was not in pain, not yet. She was asleep in her small house at the eastern edge of Ashenmoor, and her breathing was even, and the frost in her blood was still in its first stage, still disguising itself as ordinary tiredness. She did not know what was happening to her. He was grateful for this. He went to the old oak. The clearing was different at midnight. The night bell flowers closed, their white petals folded inward like small fists, the bioluminescent moss along the roots providing the only light. Without the ambient warmth of late evening, the clearing had a quality of pure antiquity to it, a sense of the world before human presence, before villages and healers and copper coins. He had known this clearing when the oak was still living. He had been present when it fell. He pressed both palms against the bark of the fallen trunk and closed his eyes and let himself feel the full extent of what he was about to give up. 6 centuries of accumulated power. The ability to move through the forest as part of it rather than merely within it. The silver threads in his eyes that he had never particularly thought about until this moment, when he understood they were about to go dark. The way the Thorn Guardians stepped aside for him. The way the root network carried his awareness across the full breadth of Volundra like extensions of his own senses. He held all of it, completely and without flinching. Then, he directed every thread of it toward the frost in Sonia's blood. He felt the working engage, felt it the way you feel a fire catch, that specific moment when the fuel commits and there is no longer any question of whether it will burn. His power moved through the root network in a wave that he felt simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, a dissolution rather than a direction. And where it met Maerath's frost, it did not fight it. It simply overwhelmed it, surrounded it on every side and kept moving, burning through every thread and filament and elegant constructed layer, leaving nothing, because it was itself leaving nothing in its wake. The process took perhaps 4 minutes. It felt considerably longer. When it was done, the silence in the clearing had a new quality, not the breathing silence of a living forest, something quieter. He opened his eyes and looked at the night bell flowers, their closed white petals, and reached automatically for the awareness of the root network. There was nothing there. He stood with this, with the specific texture of an absence where a presence had been, and found it was both worse and more manageable than he had expected. Worse because 6 centuries of sensory experience does not disappear cleanly. The mind keeps reaching for what is gone, the way the tongue finds the space where a tooth was. More manageable because the frost in Sonia's blood was gone. He could not sense it anymore, could not sense anything through the roots. But he knew with absolute certainty that it was gone, because he had felt every thread of it dissolve, and there had been nothing left when he stopped. He sat down on the root shelf of the old oak. The forest was very quiet around him. Ordinarily, he would have understood that quiet from the inside, would have felt it as part of himself, the held breath of the Deepwood registering a significant event in its root memory. Now he felt it from the outside, a man sitting in a clearing in the dark. He looked at his hands. After a while, he found that he was cold. Sonia woke before dawn with a feeling she could not immediately identify. Not the faint cold of the past days. That was gone, completely and without explanation, like a shadow disappearing when a cloud moves off the sun. What she felt instead was something different. A sudden and urgent sense of wrongness, sourceless and directionless. The feeling of a person whose body knows something their mind has not yet caught up to. She dressed quickly and took her lamp and walked to the forest without fully deciding to. The Deepwood received her differently. Not with the usual settling around her presence, the recognition of a known thing, with something more like the silence of a room where something important has recently happened. She found him at the old oak. He was sitting on the root shelf. Her place, the place where she sat on 14 evenings, and he was looking at his hands with an expression she had never seen on his face before. When he looked up at her, she saw it immediately. The silver threads in his eyes were gone. The impossible blue remained, but it was only blue now, deep and clear and entirely, heartbreakingly human. She stopped walking. She understood, not the mechanism, not the specific working or what it had cost or what it had undone, but she understood the shape of what had happened with the certainty of a person who knows the difference between a forest that is alive and a forest that is not, and she understood it in her body before she understood it in her mind. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at him. This man who had been a king 6 hours ago, who had given 6 centuries of power away while she slept so she could not argue with him. And she felt grief rise through her chest like water rising through stone, unstoppable and cold and entirely her own. It lasted approximately 8 seconds. She was not, at her core, a person who stood still in the presence of something that needed to be fixed. "Tell me everything," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands were steady. Something had moved through her face in those 8 seconds, something that Ebramir watched with the careful attention of a man who no longer had a root network, but had not lost the habit of reading things precisely, and had settled into an expression he recognized because he had seen it on 14 evenings when she encountered something in the forest that needed navigating. Determination. The specific determination of a person who has assessed a problem and begun, already, to solve it. Sonia. Her name, she said. Her location. What she is, what she wants. Everything you know. She crossed the clearing and sat beside him. Not at her usual careful distance, but directly beside him, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his, and looked at him with eyes that were dark and steady and entirely awake. Start at the beginning. He looked at her for a long moment. At the set of her jaw, at the lamp still burning in her hand, its small flame absolutely steady. Her name, he said quietly, is Maerath. In the roots of the oldest oak in Valundra, something ancient stirred, something that had expected grief and fury and the paralysis that loss produced in human hearts, something that had not, in 3 centuries of careful preparation, accounted for this. The girl did not break. She leaned forward, lamp in hand, and listened. She spent 3 days in the Hill Women's manuscripts, not the copies that circulated among the healers of Ashenmoor, the sanitized versions, carefully edited by generations of practical women who had decided that certain knowledge was more dangerous than useful and had removed it accordingly. She went to the originals, the ones her mother had kept wrapped in oilcloth beneath the floorboards of the house, the ones Sonia had found at 12 years old and read with the focused intensity of a child who understood instinctively that she was reading something she was not supposed to know. She had memorized most of them before she understood what half of it meant. The bind was in the oldest manuscript, not described in practical terms, not the way the night bell harvest instructions were described, with measurements and timing and precise methodology. It was written around the way you write around something you are afraid to name directly, referenced in margins, mentioned in the context of warnings. The soul thread working, which the hill women of the Old Covenant called the bind, and which is not to be attempted by any living practitioner, for the cost exceeds the gain in every case recorded. Every case recorded. Sonia noted that phrasing carefully. It did not say every case that existed. She found the mechanism buried in a footnote that someone had tried at some point to scratch out. The ink removal was incomplete. Whoever had attempted it had worked quickly or nervously or both, and, in the right light, pressing the page flat against the morning window, she could read every word. A single hair, the anchor object. The night bell flowers as a living catalyst, because night bell was the only plant in the Deepwood that existed simultaneously in both the human world and the Fae one. Its roots in one soil, its blossoms breathing different air. She would need her own blood, a small amount, enough to carry intention. She would need dawn, specifically. The threshold hour when the boundary between what was and what was becoming had its least resistance, and she would need to understand, completely and without reservation, what she was agreeing to. Her life would become fuel. Not immediately, not catastrophically. The manuscripts were clear on this. The bind did not kill quickly. It consumed gradually, burning her essential human self as the price of the power it provided, the way a lamp burned oil. How much she used determined how fast she burned. A careful practitioner could extend the process across years. A reckless one could exhaust themselves in hours. She intended to be careful. She had one specific thing she needed the power for, and when that thing was done, she intended to stop. She folded the manuscript, tucked it inside her coat, and went to find Ebramir. He was at the clearing. He had been at the clearing every day since the sacrifice. She understood this without having to ask, the way she understood most things about him now. Without the forest to move through, without the root network extending his awareness across Valandra, the old oak was the place where he could sit and feel closest to what he had been. She did not find this pathetic. She found it the most human thing she had ever seen him do, and it made something in her chest tighten in a way she had learned to acknowledge and set aside. He looked up when she entered the clearing. In 3 days she had watched the adjustment happening in him, watched a 600-year-old consciousness recalibrating to a radically diminished set of inputs. He was not broken. She had been watching carefully for that because she needed to know the difference between a man who was grieving and a man who was coming apart. And what she saw was grief, cleanly. He sat straighter than most humans sat. He listened more carefully than most humans listened. He watched the forest with the specific attention of someone who could no longer hear what it was saying, but had not stopped trying. He saw the manuscript in her hands and was quiet for a moment. "You found it," he said. "My mother's copies. She had the originals." Sonia sat beside him on the root shelf and opened the manuscript to the scratched-out footnote, pressing it flat between them. She tried to remove this section. He read it. She watched his face while he read it, watched the careful evenness of his expression hold for most of it, and then, near the end, shift into something she had not seen there before. Not the smile from the 14th evening, something rawer than that. "No," he said. "I've considered the alternatives." Sonia. Her name in his voice, at that register, with that specific weight. "I gave up my power so you would live. The mechanism you are describing uses your life as its fuel source. You understand that I find these goals contradictory. I understand that you find them contradictory." She held his gaze. "I find them sequential. You kept me alive. Now I use that life for something." The silence that followed was the most complicated silence they had shared in all their evenings together. "She will come for you," Sonia continued, her voice even. "You know this. Without your power, without the forest's protection, she will come for the court, for the territory, for everything your absence makes vulnerable. She has been planning this for 3 centuries. She is not going to stop because the first phase succeeded." She paused. "And she will come for you, specifically, because she wants you to know that she won." His jaw was set. She could see the argument moving through him, could see in the particular stillness of a person who has thought through every counterpoint and is discovering that the counterpoints are insufficient. "If I do this carefully," she said more quietly, "if I use only what I need and stop the moment it's done, I have time, real time. The manuscripts are clear on that." "The manuscripts," he said, "were written by people who did not complete the ritual, which means they don't know what the actual sealing is, neither do we." She looked at the nightbell flowers at her feet, the morning cluster, open now in the early light, their impossible white petals and that smell she had never been able to name. "I know this forest. I have known it for 13 years. I know where Maerath builds her workings. I know where the oldest roots run." She looked back at him. "I know things about this place that you felt through the network and I learned on foot. Those are different kinds of knowledge, and right now mine is more useful." He was quiet for a long time. She watched him arrive at the place she had already been for 3 days, the place where all the other options had been examined and found insufficient, where the remaining option was the one you did not want but could not argue with. "Dawn tomorrow," he said finally. His voice was controlled, barely. "Dawn today," she said. "I need it done before she moves." He looked at her, at the set of her jaw, at the manuscript in her hands, at the lamp she wasn't carrying this morning because she had not needed it, because she had walked to the forest in full darkness without hesitation. He looked at all of it with the attention of a man who had spent 6 centuries reading things precisely and was reading her now with everything he had. Then he reached up and pulled a single hair from his head and held it out to her without speaking. She took it. The ritual was not dramatic. This was the thing the old stories always got wrong. The assumption that significant things required significant spectacle, that power announced itself with thunder and visible light. The bind was quiet. It asked for precision, not performance. She knelt at the root shelf of the old oak as the sky above the canopy shifted from black to the specific deep blue that preceded dawn. She placed the nightbell flowers in a circle, 12 of them, 1 for each month, the way the footnote specified, and she set the single hair at the center and pressed her thumb against the small knife she had brought and let 3 drops of blood fall onto the bark. She spoke the words from the manuscript, not loudly. The forest did not require volume. It required intention. She felt the moment the bind engaged in the way you feel a key turn in a lock, not dramatic, not painful, not the consuming fire she had half expected, a settling, a reorientation, as though something that had been loosely organized inside her had suddenly found its correct arrangement. The night bell flowers at the circle's edge pulsed once, a single slow brightening of their white petals, visible even in the pre-dawn dark, and then were still. And then the power arrived. It came from the soul thread, from the connection between her blood and his hair, and the living catalyst of the flowers, and it was not the clean, structured power of a Fae King 6th century accumulation. It was something rawer than that, something that had no pre-existing channels, no trained pathways, no inherited form. It moved through her the way water moved through new terrain, finding its own roots, carving them as it went. Her eyes, in the pre-dawn dark, began to glow, not red, not gold, something between them, a warm amber light, the color of embers at their hottest point, that illuminated Ebramir's face where he stood at the edge of the circle, watching her with an expression she committed to memory, because she did not know quite what the next hours would make of her. "I'll come back," she said. He did not say "I know," because he was not a person who said things he was not certain of. He said, "I'll be here." She walked into the deep forest alone. Maerath's lair was not hidden exactly. It simply existed in a place that most living things found reasons to avoid. Beneath the root cathedral of the oldest oak in Velundra, in the compressed darkness where 300-year-old workings had saturated the soil so thoroughly that the ground itself had a quality of held breath, of accumulated intention. Sonia had avoided this place for 13 years. Not from ignorance, she had known, from the manuscripts and from the particular way the forest's silence deepened in this quarter, that something significant lived beneath these roots. She had simply been a herb collector with copper coins and no reason to investigate. She was not that anymore. She descended through the root architecture with the bind's power moving steadily through her, feeling it as a warmth in her sternum, a brightness at the edges of her vision, an awareness of the living world around her that was not the Fae root network but was something analogous to it, something new. She could feel the soil's history through the soles of her feet. She could feel the 300-year workings in the roots around her as a kind of pressure, a density of intention that had weight and texture. She could feel Maerath before she saw her. The witch was old in the way that the forest was old. Not visibly, not physically, but essentially. She occupied the chamber beneath the root cathedral with the ease of something that had been there long enough to become part of the architecture. She was tall and dark-haired, and might have been anywhere between 30 and 300, depending on which aspect of her you looked at. Her eyes, when she turned them towards Sonia, were the specific flat black of something that had stopped reflecting light a long time ago. "The herb girl," Maerath said, not contemptuous, almost curious. "Sonia, these..." She stopped at the chamber's edge and let the amber light from her eyes do what it was doing, illuminating the root walls, the accumulated workings layered like geological strata in the compressed soil, the decades of careful preparation that this space represented. "You built all of this for him." Something moved in Maerath's flat black gaze. "I built all of this because of him. Because he didn't want you." The silence that followed had sharp edges. "You have perhaps 4 hours of that power before it begins to cost you something you cannot recover," Maerath said, and her voice had shifted, still controlled, but with something moving beneath the control. You are a human woman with 3 days of preparation. I am 3 centuries old and standing in the center of everything I have ever made. You should leave. I'm not here to fight you, Sonia said. Maerath stilled. I'm here to end this. Sonia stepped fully into the chamber and felt the bind's power respond to the concentration of old workings around her. Felt it organize itself instinctively into something purposeful. Every thread you laid in these roots, every working in this soil, I can feel all of it. She looked at the walls of the chamber, at 3 centuries of accumulated intention, all of it oriented toward a single man who had never turned his attention toward the person who built it. You spend 300 years on someone who didn't see you, and when he finally looked at someone the way you wanted him to look at you, you tried to kill her. Maerath moved, fast, faster than anything with a human body should move, and her working hit Sonia like a wall of compressed cold. The same frost she had placed in Sonia's blood 3 weeks ago, magnified and direct. The bind absorbed it, not deflected, not blocked. Absorbed, took the working into the soul thread and burned it away the way Ebramir's power had burned the original curse. And Sonia felt the cost of that absorption as a brief fierce heat in her chest and kept moving forward. What followed was not a battle in the way the stories described battles. It was closer to a conversation conducted in force. Maerath throwing 3 centuries of constructed power at a woman who had been in this forest for 13 years and knew from the ground up every root and hollow and place where the oldest workings had their foundations. Sonia did not have equivalent power. She had specific knowledge and a burning soul thread, and the particular advantage of someone who has nothing invested in winning elegantly. She found the foundation stone of Maerath's oldest working, the one buried deepest, the one laid first 3 centuries ago, when whatever Maerath had felt for Ebramir was still new enough to be the organizing principle of everything she built afterward. And she pressed both hands to the soil above it and released the bind's power directly into it. The chamber came apart from the bottom up. She walked out of the forest at mid-morning with the amber light fading from her eyes and her hands shaking and 3 burns along her left forearm, where one of Maerath's final workings had landed before the foundation collapsed and taken the rest with it. The Thorn Guardians moved aside for her on the path. She noticed this and filed it away for later consideration. Ebramir was at the clearing. He crossed it before she had fully emerged from the tree line, closed the distance with the purposeful speed of a man who had been watching that path for hours. And when he reached her, he stopped, close enough that she could see his face clearly, and looked at her with the unhurried precision of someone checking every available data point. "Maerath," she said. "I know. The forest—" He stopped. Something moved across his face. "The forest told me. Just now, through the roots." His voice had a careful quality to it. The quality of a person approaching a thing they do not want to misinterpret. A fragment. Faint, but present. She looked at him. At the blue of his eyes. Still only blue, still without the silver threads. But something in them had shifted. A quality of depth returning. Not the same as before. Not the 6th century power in its full form. But something. A beginning. "The soul thread," she said quietly. "When I used the bind against her foundations, the power had to go somewhere when the working collapsed. It went back through the thread." He reached out and took her burned hand with extraordinary gentleness, turning it to look at the marks on her forearm. She let him. His touch had the same quality it always had, complete, specific, present. But it was a human warmth now, not a Fae one, and she found she did not mourn the difference. "Are you still—" He paused, choosing words with care. "The bind, are you still—" "Yes." She felt it in her sternum, quieter now, the amber light gone from her eyes, the power banked low, but present, changed. She was not what she had been 3 days ago, and she understood, with the clarity of someone standing in the specific landscape of an irreversible thing, that she would not return to it. Something in her had reorganized around the soul thread, around the cost she had paid and the power she had used, and the shape of what remained was not fully human in the way she had been human before. She was something new. She did not have a name for it yet. "I need time to understand what I am now," she said, not distressed, simply accurate. He looked at her, at the burns on her arm, at her steady hands, at whatever he could read in her face, with 6 centuries of practice at reading things precisely, at whatever fragment of awareness the root network was beginning, tentatively, to return to him. "You have time," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, not because she was exhausted, though she was, but because it was where she wanted to be, and she had stopped pretending otherwise sometime in the last hour beneath the roots. He was warm and solid and present in the uncomplicated way of a person who was no longer a king and had not yet decided what he was instead. They were both, she supposed, figuring that out. Above them, the Deepwood exhaled, slow, vast, geological, and the nightbell flowers in the collapsed oak's hollow opened fully in the mid-morning light, their white petals catching the sun, filling the clearing with that smell she had never been able to name. She could name it now. It smelled like the threshold between 2 worlds, she thought, like the moment just before something becomes something else, like the exact place where an ending and a beginning were the same thing.